1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3. Test 1 2 3 1 2 3. Let me try a different. There's probably one back here.
Test 1 2. Testing 1 2 3. Test. No, we're not good. All these all your settings.
The box has got an input and output. You can't take something out of the floor. You're going to put it into the box. You can take it out of the box into the whatever device you're
Well, isn't that what they all mean?
I don't
Don't they
know.
always use this? You always use this, right? You go from here into the floor.
Yeah. We just can't figure out the sound.
I know. I'm not understanding.
And they taped over the I'm not hearing music.
Let me set up my set. See if it's the
Okay.
cable.
Okay. The witness is here, Mr. Hatch.
They had issues with this yesterday.
No, there was no issues yesterday.
Thank you for coming up. Sure.
Does it sound good? I'm not hearing. Will you check my machine?
Try places.
Whoops. I pushed the wrong button.
He's got it hooked up, right? Test 1. Testing 1 2 3.
We have an XLR plug if you have a mult.
I can go straight to the floor, but I don't think it's the port.
Yeah. Is he from the sound office? I mean the TV? Or is he? Oh, okay, great. Yeah, you've got everything set right.
Test it again. Testing 1 2 3. This one's not hooked up. It's this one.
Yeah, it's my equipment. Let me try my machine because hand me my machine. Where's my cable? Oh, my machine's upstairs. I just grabbed the cables.
Well, I'm going to ask them to record this.
So weird.
Was working in here yesterday. I was working yesterday.
It's not your cable. It's something with the port. Oh,
Could be the cable.
now you're plugged in
I'm
someplace.
plugged straight into the floor.
But my only question, you got this plugged into the
Well, we're
output.
hooked on this one. This is input,
Okay,
like you
that's
said.
better.
You have to
But still nothing. So,
Okay.
This is all I got.
Okay.
I can't guarantee anything.
Right.
You know, sometimes there's a switch on for this in the main system. Has anybody checked
For the
to make
press
sure it's
out.
switched on?
Well,
Do you have your little tape recorder?
It's at my desk.
Mine's at my desk too. I just grabbed and ran because I looked at it. Anything I can do, Kyle?
I mean, they're going to record it from somewhere else. I don't know why they're not getting it. What happened?
Nothing.
I don't know why you're not getting anything out.
Well, you're televising. We can take it off.
Okay.
This is your setup, though. Okay.
Do you want to plug me? Go ahead and plug
I mean, in case there's a
just
miracle.
in case it comes on, yeah.
Everything
I
looks
believe in
normal on
miracles.
the system, but we never shut it off, right? Good thing you're here all by
We just did this yesterday.
yourself. And it works fine?
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you, Joe. No problem.
Because her thing's
Yeah,
a
we had
mic
to
in,
call-
that's a line out, so
down
it's definitely being
yesterday because
converted,
Dan's
right?
having troubles. I think the port's gone out.
I'm good.
It's everything's fine. I mean,
I'm good.
I'll give you an update because everything's the same as yesterday.
Are we ready to go?
I am ready to go.
Okay, all right, we're going to get this started.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, good morning. We'll call the subcommittee to order. Today's hearing is on the Obama administration's July 2012 proposal to allow states to waive work and activity requirements for welfare recipients, often simply called welfare's work requirements. These work requirements originated in 1996 in the Welfare Reform Law, which passed on a bipartisan basis after literally years of debate. President Clinton campaigned in 1992 on a pledge to end welfare as we know it, and Republicans in Congress took that seriously. The landmark 1996 reforms expected welfare recipients to work or get education and training. The law also capped funding while providing states new flexibility, and it included time limits on benefits, so welfare was no longer a way of life. The years following reform witnessed some of the greatest progress against poverty and dependence in our nation's history. After reform, we saw sharp increases in work and earnings by single mothers, a 30% drop in poverty among female-headed families with children, and record declines in welfare dependence, with the TANF rolls remaining 57% below pre-reform levels even after the 2007 recession. The idea that welfare recipients should work for benefits remains extraordinarily popular. 83% of Americans support requiring welfare requirements to work for their benefits. And that's why so many Americans were shocked last summer when the Obama administration suggested states could apply to waive these work requirements for the first time. Current law, congressional intent, historical precedent, and expert reviews all confirm HHS does not have the authority to do that. A November 1996 Ways and Means summary of the new reform said it best: waivers granted after the date of enactment may not override provisions of the TANF law that concern mandatory work requirements. The reason why Congress said work requirements couldn't be waived is simple. It wanted strong work requirements. And regardless of what the administration suggests, simple logic confirms states don't need waivers to strengthen work requirements. They only need them to weaken work requirements. The House acted in September to repeal the administration's waiver policy. And unfortunately, the Senate didn't follow suit. And today's hearing allows us to review this issue as we consider the next extension of TANF required before the end of March. I believe we should make clear that Congress meant what it said about welfare work requirements. What works is work, and aggressively preparing for work. And the administration can't unilaterally waive these critical features of our welfare reform. If anything, as we will hear from several witnesses, we should be exploring how to apply these work requirements to other programs so states help more benefit recipients work or prepare for work. That's the best and the only real path out of poverty. Without objection, each member will have the opportunity to submit a written statement and have it included in the record at this point. And Mr. Doggett, I would recognize you for 5 minutes for your opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I believe in the value of work. I voted for the 1996 welfare law because I supported moving people from welfare to work. I don't believe, though there have been some spotty successes, that law has begun to fulfill its promise. And I think that the responsibility for those failures is shared by many. States who did not do their part, an administration that has not come forward with its own plan, and Republicans here in Congress who have continued to build on old false stereotypes as this TANF reauthorization has been considered. We have moved on a stop-start basis with a number of temporary extensions instead of dealing with the root causes of why we don't have more people moving into the workforce. We've dealt with such tangential issues as whether people were cashing their checks at a strip club, a liquor store, or a casino, not one of the core issues. I certainly didn't object to restricting checks from being cashed there, but it hardly addressed the core concerns of how we provide temporary assistance to those who are poor and how we use those resources to get them into jobs. Now, with yet another start-stop, we face a deadline at the end of this month without any real basic reforms. The only focus has been on attempting to limit the administration in giving the states added flexibility. In my opinion, in some areas, they have too much flexibility already and have basically used TANF as a slush fund to fund some of the social services that they should have been providing themselves and were, in some cases, providing themselves to assist those who were poor to move into the workforce and to develop better skills. And whether they needed additional flexibility, there's some good argument that they should, but what we really should be doing is a broad reauthorization of this program, looking at whether it fulfills its original purpose and whether we can make it work better for the taxpayer and for those that it is designed to provide temporary assistance to. This temporary assistance program, misnamed I believe, is increasingly irrelevant for most Americans that are struggling in poverty. In response to the worst recession in our lifetimes, enrollment in TANF moved little across the country. In 2010 and 2011, only about 1 in 5 poor children received assistance through this program. That's the lowest level of poor children receiving cash assistance since 1964. In my home state of Texas, the picture is much more bleak, as it usually is, with only 1 out of every 20 poor children receiving any cash assistance from TANF. I think all of us want to see fewer people receive assistance because they found a good job, but this is no indication that these folks that are not receiving assistance found a good job, and no one should consider it a success when fewer and fewer very poor children and families have access to a program meant to serve them. Instead of focusing on whether a waiver authority is being misused or whether people are misusing their check at a liquor store, it seems to me the fundamental concern ought to be on how we do more to lift people out of poverty and have them contribute productively to our society. Part of this strategy should include the President's call for an increase in the minimum wage. Right now, a family of 4 with 1 full-time earner working for the minimum wage is living in poverty, even after counting refundable tax credits. Increasing the minimum wage would give a pay raise to 15 million low-income workers, and it would increase the value of work for some of those leaving welfare. Increasing educational opportunities, including for our youngest children, is another strategy. And of course, defending against those who have criticized it so regularly, the Earned Income Tax Credit is another proven way of helping to lift people out of poverty, and it's doing more to lift people out of poverty than the TANF program is. We also need to consider what changes should be made in TANF. I wish that had been the focus of this hearing and the focus of more attention from the administration. We will hear from one witness later today outlining what some of those changes might be that could strengthen the program and make it fulfill its original purpose. Certainly, that purpose will not be fulfilled if we see even more cuts with sequester beginning tomorrow. Another area in which we need to address the attention of the Congress. I look forward to hearing the witnesses. Thank you, Mr.
Time
Chairman.
has expired. Thank you. I want to remind our witnesses to limit their oral statements to 5 minutes. However, without objection, all of the written testimony will be made a part of the permanent record. On our first panel this morning, we'll be hearing from Senator Orrin Hatch of Utah, who all of us know, and all of us know has worked hard to lift people out of poverty. And as many of you already know, Senator Hatch is the ranking member of the Senate Finance Committee and has been very active with Chairman Camp on the issue of TANF waivers since the administration announced its policy last July. As his written testimony notes, he has helped draft every major piece of legislation relating to welfare in the past 2 decades, including the 1996 Welfare Reform Law, whose work requirements are the focus of our discussion today. And during that time, he has worked on numerous bipartisan and even tripartisan welfare bills. We are honored to have the benefit of Senator Hatch's deep experience and expertise on this issue and greatly appreciate his willingness to testify. And as all of us recognize busy schedules among members and staff on the Hill, unfortunately, Senator Hatch has to leave shortly after his testimony. So if there are any questions, they can be submitted to the Senator in writing. Senator Hatch, good morning and thank you for being here.
Well, thank you and good morning, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Doggett, and members of the very important Subcommittee on Human Resources. I want to thank you for convening this hearing and for asking me to address all of you this morning on the Obama administration's proposal to waive federal welfare work requirements. First of all, I want to congratulate you, Chairman Reichert, on your new role as Subcommittee Chairman. I've been very pleased to work closely with Chairman Camp on this important issue, and I look forward to continuing that partnership with you and with our friends on the other side. Your long and impressive history in law enforcement has brought you in direct contact with some of the vulnerable populations that programs under your subcommittee's jurisdiction are designed to help. Your experience with these families will serve you well in your capacity as the new chairman. And while I commend the subcommittee for holding this hearing, I regret that it is necessary to have such a hearing in the first place. Authority for the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families or TANF, as we call it, and related programs expired at the end of fiscal year 2010. In the years leading up to and following the expiration of TANF, the Obama administration never proposed a 5-year reauthorization of these programs. In the 4 years since President Obama has been in office, not once did a member of his administration offer to meet with me to discuss a TANF reauthorization. Indeed, for years, the Obama administration showed no interest in making improvements to these programs. That being the case, I was stunned on July 12, 2012, when, with no advance warning, the administration released so-called guidance to states informing them that the administration had granted itself the authority to essentially, in my opinion, gut welfare reform by undermining important federal welfare work requirements. Mr. Chairman, over the past 20 years, I've helped draft every major piece of Senate legislation relating to welfare. I was a member of the Senate Finance Committee during the 1996 debate and helped manage the Senate floor during the Senate consideration of welfare reform. In 2002, I worked with Senators Brose, Snowe, Rockefeller, and Jeffords to put forth a series of recommendations known as the Tripartisan Agreement. The Tripartisan Agreement formed the basis of the TANF reauthorization legislation considered by the Senate Finance Committee. I also worked closely with then-Chairman Grassley to develop the bipartisan Pride Bill. So not only do I have a long history of developing welfare policies on a bipartisan basis, I have also been intimately involved in all the major deliberations on welfare policy. That being the case, I can say with confidence that at no time in the nearly 20 years of discussions did members of Congress ever contemplate granting the executive branch the authority to waive federal welfare work requirements. Now, the Obama administration has stated that they need to be able to waive the work requirements in order to, quote, explore new ways to strengthen work requirements, unquote. The Obama administration has not elaborated on what is contemplated by the word strengthen. However, we do know that these unknown new ways to strengthen work requirements do not mean limiting what counts as work to actual work or job searches. These new ways to strengthen work requirements do not mean actually requiring more people to work. That is because under current law, there are no restrictions on a state's ability to increase or strengthen the work requirements. A state does not need a waiver to limit the number of activities that it considers work. A state does not need a waiver to increase the required hours of work for welfare recipients. A state does not need a waiver to increase the number of able-bodied adults who are working in exchange for their welfare check. So if strengthening the work requirements does not mean limiting what counts as work, and it does not mean increasing the number of people engaged in work for longer hours, then what does it mean? For guidance in answering that question, we should consider what types of policy changes a state would need a waiver for if the administration had the authority to provide such waivers in the first place. A state would need a waiver to increase the number of activities that could count as work, like, for example, adding education and substance abuse treatment to the list. Mr. Chairman, as you know, there are already 12 different definitions of work described in the TANF law, and some states have demonstrated considerable creativity under the flexibility that currently exists to count things like bed rest and personal journaling as work. In addition, a state would need a waiver to count towards the participation rate a person performing less than the required number of hours of work per week. And a state would need a waiver to meet a performance measure other than the current requirement that the state engage at least 50% of able-bodied adults on welfare work and related activities. In short, the approach envisioned by the Obama administration would mean less work for fewer hours and for a smaller share of adults on welfare. Now, this approach is contrary to a work-first approach that has been an integral feature of the welfare program, or reform. Over the years, research has consistently demonstrated that a work-first approach, continuing an intense effort to engage the client in work-related activities to foster an attachment to work with a blended menu of work supports, education, and training, has the greatest degree of success in getting clients off of welfare. The reason that I'm so vehemently opposed to the administration's scheme to undermine the welfare work requirements is that I believe it will hinder, not help, adults from exiting the welfare rules. Put simply, allowing activities that are not work to count as work will not get people into work. Now, Mr. Chairman, last year I sent President Obama a letter asking him to withdraw his welfare work rule and submit a TANF reauthorization to Congress. I pledged to the President that I would work in good faith with him to craft bipartisan welfare legislation that can help fragile families progress towards greater self-sufficiency. To date, I have not received a response to my letter, and the President has not withdrawn his welfare waiver rule, nor has he submitted a TANF reauthorization to Congress. Therefore, in my opinion, Congress must act. Congress must stop this executive overreach and prevent this administration from undermining key provisions of welfare reform. I am hopeful that this hearing today will be the first step in a process that leads the House of Representatives to pass legislation to invalidate the administration's welfare waiver rule. And I hope that the Senate will act in a similar fashion. I'm counting on you. I'm counting on a bipartisan effort to really keep this work requirement as a substantial and working work requirement. And I will do whatever I can to make sure that that occurs. And I just want to thank you for holding this hearing. I respect each and every one of you, and I know these are tough issues, but I feel really deeply about this. And one reason TANF works so well is because of the work requirement. And a lot of people found that going to work was a good thing. And what we need to do is find better ways of opening up the doors so that they can work and get the jobs that they need. Thank you so much. It's been a privilege to be with you.
Thank you, Senator, for your testimony. Thank you for helping us understand this issue a little bit better, and we can tell that you're passionate about this and are willing to help us in any way that you can. Your presence here today is absolutely a sign of that in your testimony, too, and your comments after. So we look forward to working with you, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
And I'll repeat to the members of the panel here that if you have any questions for the Senator, you have the opportunity to submit those in writing. Thank you again, Senator. Have a great day.
Thank you so much. Good to see all of you again. Thank you for your kindness.
Now, with the next panel, please take their seats, and we'll begin the second panel of witnesses. Good morning. Are you situated? Thank you for being here this morning. Our second panel this morning, we'll be hearing from K.E. Brown, who is the Director, Education, Workforce, and Income Security, U.S. Government, from the U.S. Government Accountability Office. Jason Turner, Executive Director, Secretary's Innovation Group. Elizabeth Lower-Bosch, Policy Coordinator and Senior Policy Analyst, Center for Law and Social Policy. And Douglas Besheroff, Professor, School of Public Policy, University of Maryland. Welcome. Ms. Brown, you can proceed with your testimony, please. You have 5 minutes. Thank you.
Chairman Reichert, Ranking Member Doggett, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me here today to discuss waivers of work provisions in the TANF program. I will talk about whether states expressed interest in these waivers and whether HHS granted any. My remarks are based primarily on a report we issued last September. As you know, one of TANF's key goals is to promote job preparation and work to help end dependence on government benefits. In fact, states are expected to ensure that a certain percentage of work-eligible families participate in work activities for a minimum number of hours each week, and these requirements are specified in law. Before TANF, under the Aid to Families with Dependent Children program, 46 states received approval from HHS to implement about 113 waivers between 1987 and 1996. These waivers were granted under Section 1115 of the Social Security Act and allowed states to conduct pilot or demonstration projects to test the effect of changes to the existing program. Some of the waivers tested policies that became key features of the TANF program, such as stronger work requirements and, for the first time, time limits. When TANF replaced AFDC, states with ongoing waivers were permitted to continue to operate their programs under these waivers until they expired. The last one expired in 2007, and no provision in law allowed these AFDC waivers to be extended. Further, since TANF was created, HHS has not granted any waivers related to the program, although several states have expressed interest. Specifically, from 2000 through 2009, we found that 5 states asked HHS about the availability of waivers under TANF. For example, 2 states requested waivers because they thought that unanticipated circumstances, such as the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks, might result in their noncompliance with certain federal TANF requirements. In these cases, states generally were not asking for waivers to test new approaches through pilot or demonstration projects, which would be necessary in order to get a waiver under Section 1115. Instead, they were asking to be excused from specific requirements. HHS officials responded each time that they did not have authority to provide waivers and offered to work with the states to address their concerns through other flexibilities allowed under the law. Then, in 2001, in response to a presidential memorandum, HHS asked the states for ideas of how increased administrative flexibility could lead to improved TANF outcomes. HHS documents show that 5 states indicated their interest in waivers that were specifically related to TANF work requirements. In their response, HHS officials indicated that the department was in the process of reviewing its TANF waiver authority at that time. In July 2012, HHS issued the information memorandum indicating the Secretary's willingness to exercise Section 1115 waiver authority related to TANF work requirements. I should clarify that we have not done an analysis of HHS's legal authority to grant these waivers. As of September 12th of last year, HHS documents showed that 8 states had expressed interest in pursuing these waivers. We recently learned that 2 additional states have expressed interest. However, no state has formally submitted to HHS a request for a waiver. In conclusion, in contrast to the AFDC period before TANF, there have been no new waivers granted under TANF, and until last year, we found no formal documentation that HHS believed it had authority to waive work requirements. This concludes my prepared statement. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Brown. Mr. Turner, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Jason Turner, formerly Mayor Giuliani's Commissioner for Welfare, Medicaid, and WIA during his 2nd term. Now I serve as the Executive Director of the Secretary's Innovation Group, a network composed of 18 state human service secretaries representing more than half the population. Our members hail from Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Virginia, South Carolina, Florida, Louisiana, Texas, Arizona, and 6 other states. We exchange state innovative program ideas and support national policies which favor work and economic self-reliance, healthy families, budget discipline, and an orientation toward limited government. I'd like to take this opportunity to describe the circumstances in the period leading up to the passage of the Temporary Assistance for Needy Family Program and how it relates to the current discussion over work requirements in the law. During the 1980s, there was an increasing public concern over the growth of the TANF predecessor program, AFDC, which you're well familiar with. To address this concern, HHS sponsored a large-scale experiment in which some families received fairly generous, unrestricted cash benefits via a negative income tax, and a control group did not, in order to see what the positive and negative effects were. This experiment showed that those receiving the unrestricted welfare benefits worked significantly fewer hours and experienced higher levels of family dissolution than those in the control group. In other words, free money without obligations resulted in bad social consequences, something our grandmothers may have remarked did not require an experiment to predict. Partly as a result of this large-scale experiment, the Congress passed the Family Support Act in 1988, an education and training program intended to move recipients to work, and based on the premise that welfare adults would qualify for jobs and accept them if they were provided additional education and training to improve their skill levels. Regrettably, experience showed that this new provision of education and training did not have this effect. In fact, the opposite occurred from what we'd hoped. In the first 5 years after the program was activated, rather than declining, the caseload increased by 1/3 to its highest levels ever. Faced with these disappointing results, HHS conducted a multi-state, multi-year comparison of the effectiveness of the education and training model embedded in its then Family Support Act program against a work-first intervention, otherwise known as a labor attachment model. Under the work-first approach, welfare recipients are encouraged to get into the labor force as soon as they can, find a job, and improve their employment and wage circumstances from that point forward. as by contrast to the skills model where they remain outside the labor force while they undergo remedial education and training. The results unequivocally favored the work-first labor attachment model. The research concluded employment-focused programs generally had larger effects on employment, earnings, and welfare receipt than education-focused programs. And given the large number of programs examined in the research and their variety of served populations, of implementation features, and of different labor markets, these results provide more support for the advantages of employment-focused programs than education-focused ones. With all of these considerations in mind, the Congress spent a great deal of time evaluating alternatives as it crafted its 1996 legislation. The resulting program allocated funds to states with a substantial operating flexibility, but with the understanding that states must place an increasing number of adult recipients into employment or work-related activities. Why didn't Congress just allocate funds via an unrestricted block grant? I can answer this from my perch. At the time, in the early 1990s, as the HHS director of the AFDC welfare program, and subsequently as a state welfare director in Wisconsin while all of this was happening. In general, states find it easy to run voluntary programs of remedial education and training where slots are already available via community colleges or WIA, and recipients can take advantage of these or not as they wish. From a state's point of view, it's bureaucratically hard to run a mandatory program based on work activities. This is because a mandatory work program requires more supervision, more creation of qualifying activities, more attendance tracking, and more follow-up to assure progress is being made. But we know from experience the harder approach is necessary. Our member states and the Secretary's Innovation Group are not calling for the weakening of TANF work requirements, but the opposite. Our TANF policy brief lays out just such a policy agenda. Finally, as a former federal executive branch official and a former state welfare director, I tend naturally to favor executive branch authority and flexibility. But I also know that this impulse can be taken too far and lead some states to take the easy way out, when we know from robust experimentation and the results of the TANF program that an ambitious work-first program will lead to increased employment and decreased dependencies. We think policy should be carefully considered by the Congress, not abandoned by executive fiat.
Thank you, Mr. Turner. Ms. Lorbosch.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to share CLASP's views regarding the work rates that states must meet under the TANF program. CLASP develops and advocates for policies at the federal, state, and local levels that improve the lives of low-income people. In calling this hearing, Mr. Chairman, you said that welfare should empower able-bodied recipients with the tools to secure a job, lift oneself out of poverty, and provide for one's family. I agree. Stable employment in a well-paying job is the best pathway out of poverty and into the middle class. Employment is one of the key ways that people contribute to society. Where we may disagree, however, is whether the work participation rate under TANF is an effective way of promoting this goal. I do not believe that it is. The work participation rate only measures attendance. It does not make any attempt to measure the effectiveness of states' employment programs, whether these programs actually get people jobs. It forces states and caseworkers to focus on documentation rather than helping clients, and unnecessarily limits the range of activities that can be counted. In an economy where family-supporting jobs are increasingly limited to those with at least a post-secondary credential, and where those without at least a high school diploma find it harder and harder to find any employment, low-income parents need access to the training that would allow them to escape a cycle of low wages, unstable work, and poverty. Many states have particularly highlighted as a problem the limits on counting basic education and GED classes toward the work rates. States have learned much about work-focused education in the decades since such programs were last evaluated, and we are also in a very different economic context. While the labor force participation of low-income mothers did increase dramatically during the 1990s, this was not primarily due to the TANF work participation rate. Rather, I would credit the combination of the strong economy, the messaging effect of welfare reform, and the package of improvements that made work pay for low-income mothers. These included a rising minimum wage and expansions of the earned income tax credit, child care subsidies, and public health insurance. States would almost certainly continue to enforce a work expectation even in the absence of federal requirements. Moreover, the vast majority of low-income parents themselves value work and want to support themselves and their families. They do not need more work requirements, but work opportunities and employment supports. Looking to TANF reauthorization, we should start tracking at the state level performance on a wide range of outcome measures, including employment, poverty, deep poverty, and other measures of material hardship. TANF should not be considered a success while millions of children are being left in deep poverty. States that are willing to be held accountable for the outcomes they achieve in their programs, such as employment entry, job retention, or poverty reduction, should be given the ability to opt out of the process-focused participation rate, either for the entire TANF population or for groups participating in specific programs, such as career pathways initiatives, in exchange for rigorous evaluation of these efforts. Whether such a flexibility is provided through waivers or through new state options allowed under reauthorization, such experiments would help identify the most effective service models in the current environment. These pilots would also help to identify possibilities and pitfalls in moving more broadly from process measures to outcome-based performance measures. In my written testimony, I do discuss some modest changes to the work participation rate that can significantly reduce the negative effects as it's currently designed. Foremost among these is the replacement of the caseload reduction credit with an employment credit. I also discuss funding and the value of creating a permanent source of support for subsidized employment programs. These received bipartisan support at the state level when they were funded with the TANF Emergency Fund. I really think we should build on that experience. I appreciate the opportunity to provide CLASP's perspective. I know welfare has often been a subject of deep disagreements, but I do believe it's possible to find common ground in improving the effectiveness of TANF in promoting work opportunity for low-income parents. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. Mr. Bregeroff.
Chairman Reichert, Ranking Member Doggett, other members of the committee, it's good to see you again. What a time we're in. I appreciated the comments of the other panelists and Senator Hatch. My view is that this waiver, and I don't know anything about its legal basis, I know it wasn't intended when the bill was written by anyone on either side. My sense is that this waiver both goes too far and doesn't go far enough. And let me explain what I mean by that. It goes too far because there was one lesson we learned very clearly through the lead up to welfare reform, and this is something that Jason Turner and Senator Hatch talked about. The evidence was really clear that the best way to, as the Europeans say, activate welfare recipients was to do work first, encourage them to look for a job, help them look for a job, and that job training had to be second or third at best. I think that's right. I think the evidence from Europe, which I'll talk about in a minute, is similar. But it's reinforced by the evidence in this country. Next week, the House will take up WIA, the Workforce Investment Act. And the sad truth is the evaluations of that program show that it's hardly effective for the low-income families it's meant to serve. So that's why I say this waiver goes too far. It seems to abandon work first, and it seems to put too much reliance on a failed policy, which is our current job training program. But it also doesn't go far enough. And what I mean by that is we use the phrase, both sides use the phrase flexibility, coordination, trying new things. But the new thing, the big thing, the needed waiver, the needed coordination is between TANF, which has now become something like a block grant, and a small one at that, and food stamps, UI, and the disability program. SNAP, UI, and disability now far, far outweigh what we spend on TANF. They provide an alternate route for government support, and each one of them separately has a minimum of welfare to work, work experience, job first provisions. A true waiver for flexibility would do something about all those programs. Now, I think I'm here partly because at the University of Maryland I study programs in socialist Europe. And that includes now France and Italy, as well as Germany, the Netherlands, and the Nordic countries. And they are all moving to the kind of combined work-first program that I'm talking about. If you look for a moment, I think you have a full-size picture of Figure 1. And this is part of the conversation we're having about the broader U.S. economy. And I don't for a moment want to say that it's only welfare or only disability that causes what is a striking decline in the labor force participation, in the employment rate of Americans. But if you look at this, the United States is in red, and you see a sharp decline at the time of the recession. While the Germans were increasing, the Dutch have held constant. The French are doing things to try to improve their labor force participation. What are all these countries in Europe, all of them, whether led by conservative or socialist countries, doing? They're combining their recipient programs, the equivalent of disability, the equivalent of SNAP, the equivalent of unemployment insurance, into one program. They're housing those programs in the same office. When someone applies for any one of those programs, those people are treated the same. The agency looks to see what the barriers are to employment, and through a combination of work first and other assists, tries to help those people go to work. That's why I say this waiver both goes too far and not nearly far enough. It goes too far because I think it undermines the original finding that led the Congress to pass TANF, which is that work first works. And second, it doesn't go nearly far enough because this administration, although it has said it supports broad waivers across programs, didn't use this opportunity to allow the states to combine their SNAP programs and their UI programs. And the SNAP, at least I know there's legislative authority, they could have done that. Thank you very much, and I'm sorry I went over.
Don't apologize, it was only 19 seconds. Thank you all for your testimony. We will now move into the question phase. So I'll ask Mr. Turner a question, but I noted a few comments by the panel that sort of struck a personal note with me. Mr. Turner's comment about free money without obligations results in bad social consequences. Ms. Lowerbosch, what activities are actually effective in helping people get jobs? And then Mr. Bregeroff, help people look for a job, and the training can be second or third in the process. And it just sort of reminded me of my childhood. I'm the oldest of 7 children, and my father had trouble at a few times in his life finding work, especially when we moved from Minnesota to Washington State in the 50s. We were on, I think they just called it state assistance back in those days, or public assistance or something like that, and stood in a food bank line, which wasn't really a food bank back then. It was a place that you went to, one place in Seattle where they gave you bags of, paper bags of bulgur wheat and flour and, the staples. And I remember my father really struggling with being on public assistance. His self-esteem was sort of erased. There was no real pride there. There was domestic violence happening at home, created a lot of stress. I don't know what happened, but eventually what he did is he turned to an activity, and the activity was he would walk. I know you hear these stories all the time. I walked 4 miles to school in the deep snow, So this is a story my father and my mother told me, that he walked to work to a place where he thought he might get a job and sat on a curb with his lunchbox for 2 to 3 weeks and asked the guard in the guard shack, do you know if there's any openings? The activity was him walking to the place where he wanted to go to work, sat down on a curb with his lunch bucket, and waited. Eventually, somebody came out and said, we know you're out here wanting to work. We'll hire you. And he got a job there. And so was that an activity that led to employment? It's hard to define, isn't it? I think that the training then, of course, came second. He got the job and went in and became a steel worker where they built railroad cars back then. Now it's Kenworth Trucking in Seattle. But I'm sure that a lot of people in this room and on this panel can identify with those things throughout their lives or family members. So we really want to try and fix this. We want to make sure that we get people back to work, and that's the challenge here. Mr. Turner, today we've been discussing work requirements and in the TANF program, and your testimony has provided a good summary of how Congress arrived at the current structure of work requirements in the TANF program. But TANF is only one program among many that are intended to help low-income families. Do other similar programs that provide help to low-income families have anything comparable to the TANF work requirements? If not, should these programs have activity requirements more like those in TANF? I think Mr. Brejeroff, you sort of touched on that a little bit. Mr. Turner, comment, and then maybe Mr. Brejeroff can speak to it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll leave it to Mr. Brejeroff to comment on the specific programs. But let me just say, in response to that, is that work activation or work activity, even where private employment is not available immediately, has tremendous benefits to anybody in any circumstance receiving assistance. The benefits to staying active, such as you described in your family history, are immense. We know, for instance, that those who are engaged in a work activity, they benefit by keeping active, by keeping social with other people, by making connections with prospective employers or other people that can help them find employment. We know that they stay healthier. We know that if you're not active, you tend to become isolated and you stay at home. We know that your health declines, depression increases, isolation sets in, substance abuse goes up. So the longer you're inactive after having been employed, the more your prospects decline over time. And so one of the things that work activation does, if you think of this as being the whole population of the low-income people that are being served on welfare, a subset of that can be employed in the economy, and like an accordion, it goes up and down. The private economy takes more people and then takes less people. But you want to keep the entire population activated and doing something so that they're on the bench ready to get off and go back into the football game. So in a sense, work activation is a program idea for all seasons, whether it's whether the economy is strong or weak.
Thank you. Let me take SNAP, food stamps, as an example. It's a very large program now. I think now a majority of the people who receive food stamps are working. And so that complicates this matter tremendously. Tomorrow I'm going to be speaking at a panel at the USDA on this question of how to activate food stamp recipients. And the issue is many of them, probably more than half, are working. They probably have spouses who work. But there is a substantial number of people who receive food stamps who aren't working. And the challenge for the Congress is to make a distinction between those groups and find a way for the non-working recipients to be activated, to use the European term. And I really want to emphasize that even at this time of high unemployment, work first, job search works. The Europeans have done studies because they have higher unemployment rates than we do. And the reason I asked an economist about this, what's the fancy word, because I'm going to testify, and it's variance from the mean. That's a fancy way of saying some counties today have unemployment rates of 25%. Other counties, other localities have unemployment rates of 5%. Some places have no jobs for aerospace engineers, but loads of jobs, entry-level jobs. So we can't even use the unemployment rate as a reason for not encouraging work first. We just have to apply it in a reasonable and confident way. And I think that the TANF rules, as they were, tended to do that. And we saw very few examples of people saying TANF's been unfair or the state agencies have been unfair during the recession. And I think that bespeaks well of the system that the Congress adopted now almost 20 years ago.
Thank you for your response. Mr. Doggett, you're recognized for questioning.
Thank you very much. Ms. Lorbash, let me ask you a very hypothetical question. Let's suppose that we lived in a world in which a significant number of the members of Congress did not feel there was political advantage in building on old stereotypes of welfare Cadillacs, of members of our society devoting their days to using taxpayer money at liquor stores and strip clubs, of numbers of Americans who desired to just live on the dole instead of to work, and that instead of building on those stereotypes, there was a genuine, broad-based, bipartisan interest in Congress to lift people out of poverty. And let us suppose we lived in a hypothetical world where an administration was not afraid of being stereotyped itself and provided some bold leadership with the TANF law coming up for reauthorization to make recommendations about how we might lift people out of poverty, and that this law and its reauthorization could play at least a limited measure in doing that. What would you see in that hypothetical world as the key elements that we need to have in a law focused on lifting people out of poverty, reducing the underclass in this society?
Thank you. That's a big question, and obviously, TANF by itself is not going to lift everyone out of poverty, and clearly the other programs that Dr. Bashar mentioned are very important, the minimum wage, people, the labor market as a whole. So obviously, TANF is only going to be a piece. Within TANF, I do think it is engaging people in work activities to the extent that they're able. I do think it's recognizing that some people are going to need to take a more indirect path, that, if people are in the middle of being homeless, if their kids are, about to go into foster care, that they need to focus on getting housing or resolving the problems that are in crisis. If they do have mental health or substance abuse issues, they might get a job, but they're going to get fired from it but if they're really in trouble. So they need to resolve those issues and then move to work. I think at a federal level, I do think providing flexibility to states in return for real accountability on their accomplishments. As I said, I think funding subsidized employment, because that's clearly, when the private sector jobs are not available, a great way to give people real work experience, real connections to the work, and it also helps the employers. We know a lot of small businesses benefited from that during the recession.
Some of the testimony has indicated that the job training and educational opportunities really don't accomplish very much. And it does appear that some of these job training programs have not been very successful. what's your assessment of the role in any reform we have of the outcomes we should require concerning education and job training programs?
Right. So let me start with the jobs evaluation, which is the study that did drive a lot of this belief that education doesn't work. And those programs clearly were not very effective. People were in very low intensity programs. They didn't get anywhere. We know now that you need to have credentials that have value in the labor market. It needs to be much more connected to what employers say they need and not just more classroom-based. We have learned a lot in the past 20 years. The economy has also frankly changed. The unemployment rate for people without a high school degree is twice what it is for anyone else. And employers are increasingly unwilling to just hire the folks like your dad who've got a great attitude but don't have any of the skills. They want people ready to show up and do the job on the first day. And so we need to give people access to that training.
We've already let one program, the supplemental grants under TANF, expire. That was a benefit in Texas in a total of 17 states. What is the effect of losing that supplemental program, and how should it be a factor in looking at further revisions or reauthorization of TANF?
Right. So overall, the value of the TANF block grant has been fixed in nominal dollars since it was created in 1996, so it's lost about 30% of its value. In the 17 states that got supplemental grants, obviously the cut has been even greater. As we know, states do a lot of different things with their TANF block grants, so in some cases it's hard to pin specific things, but we know in recent years states have been cutting actually their welfare to work contracts in many cases, providing less services. In many cases, childcare has gotten cut back, which means that in some states, people are back to this crazy catch-22 where you have to go on welfare in order to get a child care subsidy because the waiting list for child care for the working poor is so long. All these things happen when the funding gets squeezed over time.
Thank you, and to all the witnesses, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Doggett. Mr. Kelly, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Turner, I was really interested in your testimony, and one of the things is the dissolution of the family. And when I look at the title of this, the temporary assistance for needy families, the key to that being a temporary, this is getting a bridge from one point to another. And when we look at all these programs, we look at what the intentions were and then how far we get away from some of those things. But in your testimony, you talked, I think it's on page 1 about the dissolution of families. If you could just address that a little bit, because I think the concern is, and coming from the private sector, I never, ever in my lifetime, ever regretted investing one penny in any type of a program that would train the people that work for me at our dealership to get from where they were to where they could go, depending on their potential. But the key was we already had jobs for them, we had a market ready for them, we had a way for them to rise from where they were. I just look at some of these programs, and I think, Ms. Labarge, you just made a statement, we're so far away from what we intended originally. Thanks for the variance in means, that's great. And I wonder, I've only been here 2 years, but you know, the idea was a great idea. But we want it to be a bridge from where you are to where you want to be and where you can be and where you should be. So, Mr. Turner, talk about this dissolution of family, because I see in our culture right now, in our society, that basic family being broken down for a lot of different reasons. A lot of it has with the economy. But you've got to be able to take care of your own. You've got to be able to take care of yourself, and you've got to be able to dream that you can actually rise from where you started to wherever you want to go. This is troubling, is it not?
Yes, I think you're right. Absolutely, it's troubling. And the family is the original income transfer program, if you will, meaning fathers, mothers, and children all transfer support to each other within the family unit. And once the family unit is dissolved and fathers and mothers go their separate ways, it's very difficult for government to substitute as a parent or as an income source for the family. What they found out in this experiment is that over time, in 3 and 5 years of samples, both blacks and whites, and to a lesser extent Chicanos, had marital dissolution effects that were significant. We don't know precisely how that works, but we think that when there is an income that comes in that's not connected to the father or the mother's active employment and bringing money into the family, that the two parties tend to separate both psychologically and have different sources of income. And because they have an alternative source of income, tend to stop working and family breakup occurs.
Well, and we can go, when you expand that and you look at different programs that are available, really it is that ability to stay together as a family, to get through the hard times that makes it very, very real then, that as you go forward as a child, if you see your parents working that way and you know that they depend on each other for the general good of the whole family, then it works. I have noticed, at least in my lifetime, and I don't have data to support this. This is just what I've noticed. I've noticed that those folks that really have that strong family bond, that nuclear family, tend to be able to get through hard times really well and then tend to duplicate those same experiences as they get older. So listen, I know these programs are all necessary, and I think that we want to make sure that they're reaching the goal that we intended for them. So I want to thank you all for being here today. It's so important that we hear from you and that we continue this open dialogue to find out what we can do to really help our fellow citizens that need our help right now, but make sure that at the end result actually gets to where we want it to be, and we don't create some type of a model that leads to a further dissolution of the family and a further separation of those roles that I think we consider so basic in our society. So I thank you, and I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. Mr. Davis, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I too want to thank our witnesses for being here and for their testimony. You know, as I listened to the discussion and as I thought about it prior to coming, Ms. Brown, am I correct when I recall that you indicated that since the creation of TANF, there had been very few requests for waivers from states?
That's correct.
You have any idea why there may not have been any?
Well, we've been talking about that, and I think one of the things to bear in mind is that in the early years after TANF was created, states did have a great deal of flexibility, and they were experimenting and designing their own programs. And as time went on, the requirements for keeping your work participation rate and the constraints that states faced in meeting those work participation rates may have at that point increased some of the interest that we saw in more recent years asking for waivers. But beyond that, we know that what was requested and we know what HHS said, but we have not done a lot of work on the reasons behind that.
And you have not had to do a lot of work on trying to determine whether you would or would not grant a waiver. Is that, I'm saying if nobody's asking, then you don't really have to deal a great deal with that, right?
I see your point, yes.
Ms. Bash, let me ask you, the director of the Congressional Budget Office testified last week that the budget cuts in the sequester, which begins tomorrow, would reduce employment by 750,000 jobs by the end of the year. How do you think this might affect or impact our efforts to take people from welfare and put them to work?
Obviously, as you know, A few of the job losses from the sequester may directly impact low-income parents. Both, some of them may work at, school aides or something like that in a sector that would be affected. But it's more likely the indirect effect of just overall on the economy and reduced job growth and reduced jobs. So yes, it will make it harder for people to find work. Many families, low-income families, will obviously be affected by the direct spending cuts to things like Head Start and WIC as well.
Well, I feel that there's a tremendous amount of myth that is projected and percolated about the willingness of people and the desire of individuals to work. I've lived in low-income communities all of my life, from the time that I was born until even today. And many of those individuals had some difficulty. I was intrigued by the chairman's story relative to his childhood because my family had pretty much the same experience. I can recall my father saying that he would rather drink muddy water than stand in a line to get some food and sleep in a hollow log. I mean, that was his expression. And so this notion somehow that there are these vast numbers of people who want to live off public help, I think is more myth than reality. Are you aware of, Ms. Bash, programs that really help facilitate the entree of individuals into the workforce, and what are some of those?
So there's...
Can you make your answer short? Time has expired.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I guess I just want to say that, we do think it requires both pieces. It requires the skills for the jobs, but also the actual connection to the employers who are hiring. That we know successful programs don't just train people up and then send them out on the world, but they really make those direct connections to employers, and in some cases give them the opportunity to demonstrate their work skills.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. Mr. Renacci, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all the witnesses for being here today. There was some discussion about labor, and I know my colleague was talking about sequestration, maybe the loss of jobs. But Mr. Besheroff, you've talked about in your testimony how a number of European countries have incorporated activity or welfare to work provisions into their social programs. Many of those countries have done so while dealing with high unemployment and other difficult labor market conditions. Based on your research in the area, what do you say, or what have those European countries said to those who argue welfare to work policies cannot be effectively implemented or should be suspended during times of high unemployment?
Well, that's the crucial question here. And I think the answer depends on the political system or the political party in charge in each country. There's been a real pushback in Germany and somewhat of a pushback in some of the Nordic countries, but in the countries run by liberal or socialist governments, such as France, there's been no pushback. Here's the argument. They look at that chart, which I showed you on Figure 1, and they see someplace between 60 and 70% of the people who are eligible to work in the right age category working, but 35% not working. And they see that number growing. And they don't think that they have a future economically when the number is decreasing, when there are fewer people working. And so they take a deep breath and they say, we have to push as many people as possible into looking for work. When they do that, two things happen. Number one, people who otherwise were disenchanted or discouraged about finding work, some of them find work. And the other part that happens is because there are people looking for jobs, and there is a push and pull about this, because there's more supply of workers, especially low-income workers, employers are more likely to expand and hire people. Now, this isn't a magic potion, and we're not going to eradicate unemployment. But we do have to use every means at our disposal to get the United States back in fighting shape. And this is one of the ways. One of the ways is to encourage everyone who is of the age to work and healthy enough to work to look for work.
Thank you. Mr. Turner, Congress has spent years designing, reviewing, and modifying work requirements in TANF programs, and it is for that reason I strongly believe that any changes to requirements should be first handled by Congress through legislation. But I would ask, if this waiver is allowed to move forward, is it possible that states could maybe even want to go further with waiver programs like this?
Well, what we know from good work programs is that even if somebody's not in employment, if he's engaged in a work activity that's creating something of value, it is of value to the recipient himself. For instance, in New York City, the welfare recipients engage in work in the parks throughout the city, which has increased their level of cleanliness from 85% to 95%. So why is that important? Because those people going into the parks are learning important lessons about work habits, reliability, staying on the job, taking direction from supervisors, and these are the things that employers say are most missing among the low-income population, work habits as opposed to work skills. Okay, so to answer your question from that point of view, I think that once you get away from a program which offers an opportunity to actually provide work in a work-like setting, and you do things like bed rest or staying in a remedial class, you're losing the opportunity to do what we call work hardening, or getting organized around the idea that to take a job, you have to be prepared to keep the job, to stay on the job, and to get along with people. That's the main thing that you can learn outside of the labor force in a workforce setting.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Lewis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. I want to thank all of the witnesses for being here today. Today, the House is considering a bill to reauthorize Violence Against Women Act, one of the most important life-changing bills Congress ever created. I don't know how many of you know that TANF is an important part of the puzzle in helping survivors of domestic violence get back on their feet. A Huffington Post article broke down the challenges facing poor parents in the state of Georgia, my state, in deterring applicants. In fact, the Georgia Coalition Against Domestic Violence gave up helping women apply for TANF benefits. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to submit the full article for the record.
Without objection.
Now, I happen to believe that poverty is a radical evil in our society. At one time, when we had full employment, unemployment was down to 4%, right? And we said we had full employment. There were still hundreds and thousands and millions of poor people. And we had the war on poverty. We have all these groups. Can any member of this panel suggest or tell me what should we do as a society, as a nation, to maybe have a radical good to abolish poverty from this land? It's shameful. It is a disgrace. But when you travel through America, in spite of all of the resources, there's still so many people are left behind. And you're right. They're black, they're white, they're Latino, they're Asian American, they're Native American. And I traveled and I've seen this country. If we had all the resources, if we had millions and billions of dollars in the wars, stop spending so much money on bombs and missiles and guns, and take care of our people here at home, what would you suggest that we do? What proposal, what plan?
Go ahead.
So As I said, I think it's going to be a multi-tiered thing. One problem is there's an awful lot of people who are working, in many cases full-time, year-round, and they're still poor because we've got an economy that has a lot of low-wage jobs. So there's a piece about both, improving the labor market, providing supports for workers. There's a piece about, people who have disabilities that really do prevent them from working. There's lots of different there's no magic bullet. It's going to be 30 bullets. I hate to use that metaphor, and let me not. But it's going to be a lot of different pieces to the puzzle to put together. TANF is one of the pieces, and it's been a broken link. Your example of Georgia. Georgia used to pay TANF caseworkers to go to domestic violence shelters to help women apply for cash assistance. They stopped doing that because they decided they did not want to make it easy for people to get cash assistance. You don't want people to, break up marriages when they're good marriages, but when there's a domestic violence situation, you want TANF to be that lifeline, and it's not always there. So yes, it's been a broken piece in the puzzle.
I'm struck, Mr. Lewis, by the point you made and the point that Mr. Kelly made, because they're actually two parts of the same problem, which is the weakness of the family. I was at a job training program in Newark, inner city Newark, and these were women, almost entirely minority, who had been practical nurses, and they were in a training program to become registered nurses. And this is automatic. You go from $25,000 a year to 45 or 50. It just happens. There's no there's no magic bullet. It is, once they get the skills, whether it's the Affordable Care Act or whatever, there are jobs. So this is automatic. And there were about 150 women in the room, and I said, what's the biggest problem that you have? And one of them got up and said, well, the man in my life just doesn't make it easy for me. One day I went home, all my furniture was in the street, and he had set fire to it. Now, I said to myself, this is crazy. I'm sure, and I said, how many other women have a problem like that? 3 hands. I said, you mean exactly like that? And they said, yes. Now, we have MDRC research from New York City when they did their program of job training and support for inner city women who volunteered to go through job training and find a job. And what they found that was one of the major reasons why those women didn't make it is because the men in their lives did not support the idea of them becoming independent. So some part of this is about family relations, and we may call it family violence, we may call it the broken family. But a part of this is getting these young, I'm feeling this age these days, getting these young people, right, to do it right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Lewis. Mr. Young, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member as well. An important conversation. This really does fit into the larger picture of how we address poverty in this country, so I'm glad that Mr. Lewis brought that up. It's such a multifaceted challenge, and of course, the program we're here to discuss today plays a very important role in that puzzle. The weakness of the family. I'd have to say, before I get into the immediate concern of this hearing, I think if we could get the economy to grow a little faster, that would alleviate so much. And I saw all heads nodding affirmatively on our panel when I said that. It would create more wherewithal so that we could fund these important programs, provide more hope and opportunity for people to perhaps incentivize them to, if they're not already searching for work, to go out and search more actively, and just restore some hope and dignity and prosperity in this country, because we know those on the margins of society who benefit from many of these important programs are most adversely hurt during down economies. So reforming the tax code, the regulatory code, and so on are things that we really need to do. With that said, I know we're here today to discuss the implications of HHS's unilateral decision to waive work requirements from the TANF program. At a time when national poverty rates and welfare spending are very high, at least compared to recent history, Congress needs to ensure that those who need help are receiving TANF in a manner that provides a path to self-sufficiency.
which includes ensuring that the job training programs that are out there are effective. But we must not waive requirements that have led to more jobs and earning, and also reduce poverty and welfare dependence. On that, I hope all of us can agree. Now, before the 1996 federal welfare law was signed into law by President Clinton, my home state of Indiana, under a Democrat governor, Evan Bayh, created work requirements for Hoosiers who receive welfare benefits. This ensured Hoosiers who were receiving benefits really got the benefits they needed, but we targeted this program towards those who needed the benefits most. As former Governor Bayh later said, the bottom line was trying to make someone self-sufficient. We were trying to achieve two values. One was the notion of community and also responsibility. So this is exactly, in my estimation, what the 1996 federal welfare reform law did, and is exactly what the Obama administration is undermining through this unilateral decision by HHS. So if HHS now claims they have the authority to waive work requirements, you know, I'm curious, and I'll direct this question to Ms. Brown. I know GAO hasn't conducted a legal analysis about the authority to grant these waivers unilaterally, but you did indicate that you've reviewed documentation showing that there's no evidence the administration has believed it had the authority in the past. So does this set us up on a sort of slippery slope here? What conceivably could HHS claim they could waive within the TANF program in the future?
I'm quite sure that our general counsel would advise me that I have to be very careful with this question. I think the issue—
Please don't. Just be candid and forthright.
I think the issue is that what we saw when we looked at the records was a number of requests that states had made that were not necessarily grand redesigns. And during that process, HHS said again and again, different people, different levels, we don't have that authority, we don't have that authority. And then as the president issued a memorandum asking states to, telling federal agencies to talk to states and locals about how to be more, to remove some of the burdens so that programs could move more effectively. They were hearing from states that they would like waivers, and HHS said they were beginning to think about whether they were revisiting whether they had waiver authority. That's as much as I know.
Well, that was a very carefully constructed response, but much appreciated, and I thank you very much for your testimony. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Griffin, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this hearing. Mr. Bezeroff, I want to ask you, we talked about, Mr. Young was talking about the theory upon which the change was made. I want to know why it was made. Why would we take away the requirement that some sort of work— we've heard a lot about traditional work here, but I think that's a mischaracterization. I'm looking at all the different combinations that one can engage in to fulfill the work requirement, and there's all sorts of different things. And it seems to me the point of this is to get people engaged in productive work-related, work-type activity. It's not traditional work necessarily. But why would the administration do this?
Wow. Let me just quickly follow up on what Ms. Brown said. The authority the administration is using to justify the waivers is quite a big gun. It is saying we have the authority to modify what you, the states, have to report to us. Therefore, we can waive any portion of TANF It's not just this portion based on that. I have a feeling if the shoes were on the other foot, which is to say, if this were a Democratic House and a Republican Congress, we'd have the same debate, only with different faces on the argument. This is a major expansion of executive authority. If it's legal, it's because of quite a loophole. It's the teensiest little loophole that they are driving a truck through. You asked the question, though, why might they want to do it? And it's because of the argument you're seeing here, which is some people read the history and the current situation to mean the best way to get people into a productive job is for them to get into a productive job and increase their earnings and experience. Other people think the best way to do it is through education and training first. That's a big argument. It was not quite settled in 1996, but for a while the work first people had it. They were going with it. The people who are on the losing end of that argument are, in large measure, in the administration. So they get now, as the president says, I won the election. So they're revisiting this argument about work first versus job training. I think that's what it comes down to. I think they're wrong, but I think it's a long-standing argument. One is never, I was trained as a lawyer, one is never supposed to ask a witness a question you don't know the answer to, but I believe, Jason, I believe it's the case that before you became commissioner in New York, one half of the women at the city college were on welfare.
Yes, that's actually true. And beyond that, Mr. Beshroff, they didn't graduate.
Okay. We'll save time for you to ask him questions when my time's over. Well, it looks to me like, well, first of all, education is a big part of the combinations that I'm looking at. That is something that is a part of this. For those of us who have spent a lot of time in getting an education and have spent a lot of time working, I think we can do a good job of assessing which is the best preparation for life. Correct me if I'm wrong, and I know that there was some sensitivity to getting into it, this by Ms. Brown, but the administration was, they were opposed to, legally opposed to changing this before they were in favor of it. Is that fair? Can you speak to that? If she can't, can you?
I think this was a new interpretation that reversed the opinion that HHS had for many years. It's clearly a new interpretation, and it gives them an authority that many people, including HHS, didn't know it had before.
Thank you, Mr. Beshroff. It looks like I'm out of time.
Thank you, Mr. Griffin. Thank you all for your testimony today, and thank the members for being here and being present for our hearing, important topic. We have lots of work to do. Hopefully, we can come to an agreement so we can help those people out there in our nation that really need our help. A reminder to all members, if you have additional questions for the witnesses, they will be submitted in writing, please. And we would appreciate receiving your responses when you get their questions in writing for the record within 2 weeks. We now adjourn the committee. Thank you.
Dave, do you have any sense whether this is going to